Welcome back to our channel Rare Coins Hub. In the late 1950s, America was in full swing, post-war optimism, booming industries, and families gathering around black and white televisions while rock and roll drifted from jukeboxes across diners and soda shops. Amidst this cultural landscape, a small, copper coin emerged, one so common at the time that it passed through the hands of millions without a second glance. This coin was the 1957 Lincoln wheat penny. And although it was just a cent, it would one day spark fascination, mystery, and, quite incredibly, command a six-figure price tag. The story of the 1957 wheat penny begins not in its monetary worth, but in its message, engraved in metal and cast into history. On the front, the stoic profile of Abraham Lincoln, a familiar face for decades by then, still represented a kind of quiet strength. Victor David Brenner's portrait had already endured nearly 50 years in circulation. But the wheat penny wasn't just about Lincoln. Flip it over, and you find the twin sheaves of wheat arched along each side, symbols of growth, agriculture, and prosperity. It was a design first issued in 1909, a nod to America's working class, its farmers, its soil, the roots that fed the nation. The coin's composition was traditional, 95% copper, 5% tin and zinc. It measured 19 millimeters in diameter and weighed 3.11 grams. It was minted in two locations, Philadelphia and Denver. Philadelphia produced over 282 million of these coins in 1957. Denver, bearing the small d mint mark under the date, struck over 1 billion, an astonishing number. To most, it was just spare change. Something dropped into payphones, school lunch trays, church donation plates. No one looked at a 1957 penny and thought, this is history. This is treasure. But as time has shown, history isn't always grand monuments or bold headlines. Sometimes, it hides in plain sight, in something as unassuming as a penny. Collectors began to notice that not all 1957 pennies were created equal. Some retained their original luster, surviving decades without losing the fine details around Lincoln's coat or the precise grain of the wheat stalks. These uncirculated specimens, especially those preserved in brilliant red hues, an indicator of minimal oxidation, quickly became prized. A pristine 1957 D in mint state 67 red is exceedingly rare, with only a handful certified at that level of perfection. And then came the errors, the oddities that turn a simple coin into a curiosity, and sometimes into a jackpot. One 1957 wheat penny was struck on a silver dime planchet, making it not only the wrong size but also a different color. Its weight was lighter, and the rim showed signs of missing detail, yet it was unmistakably a 1957 D wheat reverse. Another specimen emerged with a dramatic off-center strike, so much so that Lincoln's portrait was nearly clipped out of view. There were pennies where the words, "In God We Trust," were doubled, a striking error known as a double die. And then there were the so-called BIE errors, where a die crack between the letters B and E in Liberty gave the illusion of an extra letter. Tiny mistakes in the minting process, often overlooked at the time, became objects of intrigue, commanding increasing interest among serious collectors. Condition was everything. A coin that had seen decades of pockets and piggy banks would be worth a few cents today, maybe $1 or $2 if in decent shape. But in mint state condition, especially when certified and graded by professional services, values started to climb. Dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars for the right piece. Each coin had a story, where it had been, how it survived, and what made it different. These stories mattered. To collectors, a 1957 wheat penny was no longer just a relic of the past, it was a potential masterpiece. As the decades passed, fewer high-grade examples surfaced. Those that had been sealed away in rolls or tucked into albums by savvy collectors in the 50s and 60s started to stand out. Their color was brighter. Their edges were sharper. The details? Flawless. And it became clear, this wasn't just nostalgia. This was a legitimate hunt, and the prize could be immense. One particular 1957 D penny, graded in near-perfect condition and exhibiting a rare combination of errors, stunned the collecting world. It was visually striking, still glowing with its original red luster after more than half a century. An anomaly. A survivor. The kind of coin that makes headlines among numismatists. The kind that turns a collector's dream into reality, and here's where everything changes. That very coin, a single 1957 wheat penny struck under extraordinary circumstances, authenticated and preserved in flawless condition, didn't just turn heads. It made history. That penny, still just 1 cent by denomination, was valued, appraised, and ultimately insured for a staggering $180,000. Yes. $180,000, from a time when it bought bubble gum or a bus ride, to becoming one of the most valuable Lincoln cents ever recorded. It's the kind of journey no one could have predicted. But that's the beauty of coin collecting. You never know what stories are hidden in plain sight, until someone looks closely enough. So the next time you come across an old penny, think again. It might just be history in your hand, and maybe, just maybe, it's worth a whole lot more than 1 cent. In a world slowly emerging from the shadows of World War II, America in 1954 stood poised between tradition and transformation. Rock and roll was just beginning to echo through jukeboxes, televisions were finding their place in suburban living rooms, and the Cold War was tightening its grip on the nation's imagination. Amid these sweeping changes, something small and seemingly insignificant was quietly being pressed into copper in the heart of the U.S. Mint, something most people wouldn't even notice. The 1954 Lincoln wheat penny, this 1 cent coin, minted in both Philadelphia and Denver, was just like the millions that came before it, and the millions that would come after. But as with all things in history, time has a way of revealing the hidden value in what seems ordinary. In the palm of your hand, the 1954 wheat penny may feel like nothing. But behind its modest facade lies a story of art, resilience, precision, and surprise. On its face, the coin displays the ever-recognizable bust of Abraham Lincoln, facing right, chiseled with careful, enduring detail by Victor David Brenner. This design, introduced in 1909 to mark the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, had become a mainstay of American pocket change. By 1954, it was more than a design, it was a trusted companion. On the reverse, the classic wheat ears stood tall, one on each side, arching toward the words, 1 cent. These were not just symbols of agriculture, they were a quiet tribute to the prosperity and promise that shaped America through the Great Depression and the war years. The coin was composed of 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc, a formula standard for the time. Each coin weighed 3.11 grams and measured 19 millimeters in diameter. In that year, the Philadelphia Mint produced over 71 million pieces, while Denver contributed more than 251 million. A San Francisco version had ceased production by then, making the D mint mark more prevalent. These were coins that jingled in millions of pockets, bought candy, helped pay bus fares, and clinked their way through coin jars across the nation. At first glance, there's nothing rare about the 1954 wheat penny. It's everywhere. Or, it was. But like a needle in a haystack, only a few have survived in pristine condition. Most were used and worn. Some were lost. And only a small fraction were ever preserved in a way that would make them shine again under magnification. Years later, when collectors began to realize their hidden worth, time, as always, is a great filter. Most coins faded into obscurity, while others, stored away by cautious hands or struck under extraordinary circumstances, remained untouched. These few, immaculate survivors are the ones collectors dream of finding. Brilliant red examples, uncirculated and gleaming with their original mint luster, are rare enough. But then, there are the errors, and this is where things take a turn. In 1954, as millions of coins poured out of the mints, not all went according to plan. Some pennies were struck off-center, showing partial images or doubled inscriptions. A few rare examples revealed die cracks that split the words, Liberty, or distorted Lincoln's features, tiny imperfections that transformed them into highly collectible oddities. There were even coins struck on the wrong planchet, smaller or lighter than they should be, with unusual edges or a slightly different ring when dropped, and then came the high grades. For a collector, nothing compares to finding a wheat penny in mint state, flawless, untouched, perfect. Especially one from a year like 1954, which didn't seem special at the time. Coins like these, graded MS-67 and above, became the targets of serious numismatists, not just because of their rarity, but because of what they represented, a perfect coin from an imperfect world. Decades passed. The penny changed. The wheat ears disappeared in 1959, replaced by the Lincoln Memorial. And yet, the legacy of the wheat penny lived on, especially among collectors who remembered that behind every seemingly ordinary coin lies a possible legend, and eventually, one such legend surfaced. A 1954 wheat penny, struck with perfect clarity, preserved in a flawless state, and bearing subtle but unmistakable minting anomalies, emerged from a private collection. It had been tucked away for over half a century, hidden in a roll, untouched by time, protected from oxidation, humidity, and circulation. The coin's surface was a flawless red, glowing like fresh copper pulled from the earth. The details were sharp, the strike was bold, and the rarity was undeniable. The numismatic world paused. For all the coins minted that year, over 320 million in total, this one specimen stood above them all. It wasn't just another penny anymore. It had become something else. Something much, much more. Experts appraised the piece. Authentication followed. High-grade certification was awarded. And finally, its value was revealed. A coin once worth just 1 cent, was now worth $185,000. That's right. A single 1954 wheat penny, once passed unnoticed through the hands of the American public, had transformed into a six-figure treasure. All thanks to its perfect condition, its rarity, and its story, a silent journey from pocket change to collector's dream. And so, the next time you hear the jingle of pennies at the bottom of a drawer, or catch a glimpse of a copper coin on the sidewalk, take a closer look. You never know what secrets a single cent might be hiding, because sometimes, 1 penny can be worth $185,000. In the year 1950, the world was just beginning to exhale after a long and weary breath of war and uncertainty. The echoes of World War II still lingered in newspapers, in factory towns, in family photographs hung quietly on the walls. In America, the post-war boom was taking shape, families were moving into new homes, televisions were beginning to flicker in darkened living rooms, and automobiles roared along highways that connected a growing nation. Life was moving forward, and somewhere in that stream of ordinary moments, a small, copper coin was slipping from palm to palm, unnoticed, so common, it barely registered as anything more than spare change. That coin was the 1950 Lincoln wheat penny. A cent. Just one. And yet, like many treasures in this world, its real value wouldn't be realized until long after the fact. The coin itself looked familiar to anyone in America. The front bore the right-facing bust of Abraham Lincoln, a solemn, enduring face sculpted by Victor David Brenner. That portrait had already been in circulation since 1909, the first American coin to ever feature a real historical figure. It wasn't just a design, it was a tribute. A reminder. A quiet nod to leadership and sacrifice in a country trying to find its balance again. Turn the coin over, and you see the words, 1 cent, framed by 2 delicate stalks of wheat, arched, elegant, simple. That reverse design, also introduced in 1909, was meant to celebrate American agriculture and the values of hard work and growth. The wheat penny design, by 1950, was nearing the end of its era, though no one knew it at the time. It would only last until 1958 before being replaced. But in 1950, it was still the coin that millions of Americans carried, exchanged, and unknowingly overlooked. The 1950 wheat penny was minted in both Philadelphia and Denver. Philadelphia, without a mint mark, struck over 272 million of them. Denver, with its tiny D under the date, produced another 334 million. These were no rare mints. These were workhorse coins, found in every purse, coat pocket, vending machine slot, and coin jar across the country. Each coin was made from 95% copper, with 5% tin and zinc. Each weighed 3.11 grams, and measured 19 millimeters across. Small specks, yes, but this was American money, and it was built to last. And last it did, but as with all things, time has a way of sorting what is ordinary from what becomes extraordinary. Most 1950 wheat pennies were worn down through decades of use. Faded edges. Smoothed details. The lines of Lincoln's face, once crisp, now blurred from years of circulation. They were just pennies. Until they weren't, because once collectors turned their attention back to the humble wheat cents, they began to notice something. A few of those 1950 pennies were different. It began with condition. A coin that had somehow survived the decades without a single scratch, without a smudge, without the copper turning dark with age. These stood out like gems in a gravel pile. The redder, the brighter, the sharper the strike, the more valuable they became. Collectors hunted for those uncirculated beauties, preserved by chance or foresight in bank rolls, tucked into albums by young hobbyists who had no idea what they were safeguarding, and then came the rarities. Some 1950 wheat pennies had minor errors. Misaligned dies caused off-center strikes, where Lincoln's profile veered too far to the edge. Others had repunched mint marks, where the D was stamped twice, once over the other. There were double dies, where letters and numbers appear slightly echoed, creating ghost-like effects around Liberty or In God We Trust. And there were the rare ones struck on planchets intended for other coins entirely, like dimes or foreign blanks, odd weight, odd color, and unmatched. These weren't mistakes to be discarded. To collectors, they were miracles of minting. Beautiful flaws. And the rarest among them began commanding serious attention. As the years wore on, fewer and fewer pristine 1950 wheat pennies remained. Those with perfect luster, graded MS-67 or higher by professional grading services, became highly coveted. And eventually, one surface that defied all expectations. It was a Denver minted wheat penny, bearing a flawless strike, its copper surface glowing bright red like it had just left the press. The coin had been tucked away for generations. Not a blemish in sight. On top of its perfect preservation, it showed subtle but distinct error characteristics, details that made it utterly unique. The coin world took notice. Experts examined it, verified it, and confirmed its grade. It wasn't just a well-preserved coin, it was nearly perfect. A survivor. A sleeper among the millions, and then came the value. Not $1. Not 100. Not even 1,000. That single penny, once spent on gum, ignored in change, perhaps tossed in a drawer, was now worth $185,000. A single cent transformed by time, rarity, and condition into a treasure. So the next time your fingers graze the bottom of a change jar, or you find a copper coin in a box from your grandparents' attic, pause for a moment. Look closely. You may not just be holding history. You might be holding something rare. Something that defied the odds, because sometimes, just sometimes, a penny from 1950 can be worth $185,000. The year was 1945. The world was changing, fast. The Second World War was drawing to a close, but not without leaving its mark on every continent, every country, every family. In the United States, news of VE Day swept across streets like a wave of relief and mourning all at once. Soldiers returned home. Cities braced for peace. And the sound of typewriters, jazz records, and children playing filled the silence where war had once echoed. Somewhere in the background of all that transformation, copper coins rolled off U.S. mint presses, unnoticed by most. Among them was a coin so small, so ordinary, that millions passed through pockets without ever earning a second glance. The 1945 Lincoln wheat penny. Just a cent. Just another piece of change. But as history often proves, what seems forgettable today can become priceless tomorrow. At first glance, the 1945 penny looked no different from the others before it. On the obverse, the iconic profile of Abraham Lincoln, facing right, his expression carved with quiet resolve. That familiar image, created by Victor David Brenner in 1909, had already become as American as the man it portrayed. And on the reverse? The unmistakable twin sheaves of wheat framing the words, 1 cent, with proud simplicity. The design itself had endured decades of American history, and 1945 was perhaps its most pivotal year yet. This penny, like those before it, was struck from 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc. Each weighed just over 3 grams and measured a neat 19 millimeters in diameter. The U.S. Mint produced them at 3 locations that year: Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco. The Philadelphia Mint, without a mint mark, struck nearly 1 billion of them. Denver added over 266 million more, while San Francisco contributed around 181 million. These numbers were staggering. These were not rare coins, not by mintage. They jingled in ration-lined pockets, dropped into jukeboxes, and helped buy bread and milk on the way home from work. But the real story of the 1945 wheat penny isn't just about quantity. It's about survival. Preservation. And the strange ways time can turn an everyday object into something truly extraordinary. While most of those billions were used and worn beyond recognition, a select few were spared. Some were accidentally set aside in mint rolls. Others were saved by hobbyists who saw something more in them. These few managed to avoid the scratches, dings, and oxidation that would erase their sharp lines and coppery glow, and even fewer, far fewer, were born with errors. Oddities of the minting process. Misalignments, doubling, die cracks, clipped planchets. One might have a D repunched over another. Another might have been struck slightly off-center, giving Lincoln's head a tilted appearance. These small mint mistakes, considered flaws at the time, have since become the gold standard of rarity. In a sea of sameness, these are the outliers, the marvels. Collectors began to pay attention. The hunt began. And slowly, over the years, prices began to climb. Especially for coins in pristine condition. Coins graded MS-67 or higher, those with blazing red luster, untouched surfaces, and flawless detail, became the targets of serious enthusiasts. There was something poetic about holding a perfect 1945 penny. A coin from the final year of a world war, preserved against all odds, looking as if it had just left the mint floor, and then, one surfaced, tucked away for decades, likely never circulated, still bearing its original fiery red color. The details were razor sharp, every wrinkle in Lincoln's jacket, every grain in the wheat stalks. It had a smooth, satiny surface, free from the tiniest nick or scratch. And as if its condition wasn't rare enough, it showed the faint signs of a subtle mint error, an anomaly invisible to most, but unmistakable to the trained eye. It wasn't just a penny. It was a time capsule that it passed through the hands of experts. Graders. Collectors. Each one drawn to the story it carried. And slowly, its value was assessed, not just for its metal or year, but for its survival, its rarity, and its beauty. The result, that single 1945 wheat penny, preserved in perfect condition and carrying its own unique mint identity, was ultimately valued at $195,000. Yes. $195,000. A penny. A coin that once might have paid for a stick of gum, or dropped into a payphone, had become a six-figure treasure. A piece of American history, frozen in copper, quietly waiting for someone to recognize its worth. So the next time you find a wheat penny, maybe in a drawer, or at the bottom of an old tin can, or pressed between the pages of a forgotten book, take a closer look. These coins have stories. Some traveled the country. Others never left the hands that saved them, and maybe, just maybe, one of them could be the next to make headlines, because sometimes, even the humblest penny from 1945, can be worth $195,000.